I've been getting lots of questions about Lab 4.4, specifically talking about the blood type. So I thought I'd make a quick video to help you guys for anyone else who's kind of getting stuck. And so really quickly, I want to kind of point out a couple of things. This is specifically talking about something called codominance. Okay, so this codominance is specifically talking about a type of dominant allele. Remember, allele is a variation of the specific gene. Talk about that more in a second. But basically, this idea of codominance is that when you have two dominant alleles, they are both expressed. And so one thing that we've been doing in biology, and something that's usually taught in biology at the high school level, is a simplistic type of bio, right? We usually only look at two alleles, one or the other, either brown hair or blonde hair, brown eyes or blue eyes. But in reality, there are many different types of alleles. We know that we've got red hair. We know we have strawberry blonde hair. We know there are green eyes, hazel eyes. And so we've been simplifying it so that we can better understand the Punnett square. We can understand dominant and recessive. And so really what this is talking about is this idea of codominant. And so what we're talking here is recall the alleles that determine blood type. So blood type is one of those examples that there is something called codominant. And so what you have here is you have these alleles, and remember, alleles are just variations. So an allele would be, if we did big B for blue hair, brown hair, and let's say there was another one that was also dominant. The most typical one to kind of share is zebras. Zebras have stripes, and that's an example of codominance, because codominance is when both of them show up, right? And so if we've got this codominant alleles, we have to find a way to represent that they are dominant and different. And so the way they do that is they create these notations and these superscripts, that little a up there. So they still have the I being capital to demonstrate that that's dominant. And then they show you the A that represents that it is that specific variant of dominant. So for example, we've got a blood type that has a dominant A allele, and that type is A. Same thing with IB. And then you have this little I, right? This is a lowercase I that represents recessive. And so it really depends on the combination. And so if you scroll down, so as you scroll down to this table, that's kind of what they're telling you. So we've got blood type, and so this may be a little confusing because all we're seeing is I's and B's and O's and I's, and like, where did all of these things come from, right? But really what this is talking about, this blood type, is just talking about the phenotype. So if we were to replace blood type here and we were instead to say hair color, then the hair color types would be brown hair, blonde hair, brunette, black hair, right? So there are the different types of hair color, and that's exactly what these letters are representing. It's the type of blood that you have. And so when we use these representations, this big I, little I represents A, the big IB represents B, and then in order for you to have blood type, you would need to have these two dominant alleles, and then O is just what represents the recessive, and we represent that with little I. So that's kind of giving you a clue as to what these superscripts are talking about. Now, when you talk about the possible genotypes, remember, we often think of this as, that they're the same as the letters, but this is an indicator that kind of represents the dominant, the different dominants in the alleles, and they just kind of make it so that, they give you just the straight up letters that represent the genotypes instead of having to do this I with the superscript all the time. And it's just what we use in the medical world. It simplifies. But you do need to have, before you can just use this information, you do need to have an understanding and a background context of what is actually happening with these genotypes. And so we express those genotypes with our possible alleles. And so what we have here is, in order for you to have a possible blood type of A, these are the genotypes that you can have in order for you to express A, that have your phenotype be A blood. And so we have this big A, or big A O, and this O represents this recessive allele. And so that's kind of where these letter figures are coming from. If you're unclear, the O is just representing this little allele. And it's just a simpler way instead of, always having to do and demonstrate that it's dominant. So what we really start to see the codominants come in is this guy right here, right? All these other ones has single letters, but this is when we start to see that both the allele I big A and the allele I big B is going to be expressed is in this guy. And this is really our big feature when it comes to codominance. But the way that we represent codominance is when we are using an uppercase letter and then that superscript to specify that allele, right? So again, we are still using recessive and dominant, but we now are acknowledging that there is more than 2 types of genes, okay? Sometimes you're gonna, we've been talking about, we can talk about different eye shapes. Not everyone has the same eye shape. So those are different types, right? So that would be something, and some of them overpower or are the ones that are expressed and some of them aren't. And so we use the capital letters with a superscript to represent the different types of dominant alleles that are available. So that's kind of an overview of this table. And so if we go down, let's go ahead and just do a practice really quickly. So you can see that I already started with it, right? So it tells you that you're studying 2 parents. One parent has the genotype big I sub A, and then little I, and then you have a genotype of I, big I sub B, or super B, and then little I. So we're going to put those genotypes right in here, and then we're going to go ahead and do our Punnett square. So when we get big I A from a parent, big I B from a parent. So we've got one type, big I A, little I, big I B, little I, and then 2 little i's. And so when they're talking about your genotype, I did put in the alleles, but really what I should have done is I should have put in the genotypes right here. This is what I actually should have been putting in. But it's going to give you a similar idea anyhow, right? So then you need to find out the percentage. It's talking to you about calculating the possibility. So we really want to make sure that whenever we see something like that, we're including what the likelihood of that is. So that's the probability, the percent. And then if you take a look down here, right, it says, take a look at the table at the beginning of part 3. What are the possible phenotypes? And so those are the blood types of the children. And so once you get your genotypes, like again, I should have been putting down AB, this should be BO, this should be AO, and this should be OO. And then the phenotypes, what we consider is expressed. So like, for example, if we're doing big B as a genotype in hair color, the phenotype is brown, right? The color that we see. And so your phenotype for your blood would be AB because both are dominant, both need to be represented. Then you've got B with the subscript I, then you've got A with the subscript I. So those are the recessive, and those O's don't show up, right? So we don't necessarily need to include that in our genotype because that's not something that is expressed. And then we've got O blood, which is incredibly rare. It's the kind of blood that it goes with any of those blood types. And if you have type O blood, you're sought after for donations, but you're also the most difficult to receive transfusion because O blood type is rare. It's rare because it's a recessive gene. So that's kind of an overview of what they're talking about with blood types. And then they kind of go into sex linked, right? And so they talk about the X and Y chromosome, which is what determines if you're a male or a female. And then if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out. But this is just kind of a little explanation because I've received several questions. And so I thought if there are at least 5 people asking me, there's got to be many more that are also needing some guidance. So go ahead and take a look at this video again if anything didn't make sense, and then please join me in my help session and I can help you guys individually. Thank you.